Interest continues to grow in wild game farming and activities amid difficult financial times. However, confusion arises over whether these non-traditional uses of land are considered farming for purposes of tax code. Well, Roger McEowen with the Washburn University School of Law joins us now to answer some questions and offer some clarification for today's Rural Money segment. Roger, as always, thanks for taking the time to chat with us today. For those who may be unfamiliar with what exactly the exotic game activities are, why is there growing interest?
Well, good to be with you, Janet. I think there's growing interest just simply from an economic standpoint. You can, the economics of it show that you can generate greater income per acre, and just in Texas alone, we're well over 4 million acres devoted to wild game farming activities. So I think it's just primarily driven by the economic concerns, particularly in the last couple of years.
So getting to the subject at hand, do they fall under farming for the tax code definition?
Well, that's a real good question, and the answer is most likely yes, but there's no one concise and precise definition of farming in the tax code. Farming is defined in multiple places in the code for different purposes of the code and in different manners, and so it's just kind of all over the place. We've got a definition that says, well, it includes feeding, caring for, and management of animals. We've got another section that says it's included in the definition of agricultural labor and raising wildlife. But when you take all of the provisions together, and that's just a couple of them, I think it's broad enough to classify the raising of exotic and wild game as a farm. And the tax code does define an exotic game rancher as a farmer, and work on an exotic game ranch will meet the definition of ag labor.
What about the appropriate depreciable recovery period of exotic game animals under the modified accelerated cost recovery system?
Yeah, well, here again, we're kind of all over the board. Cattle, sheep, goats, they have a 5-year recovery period. Breeding hogs, those are 3-year property. But then IRS said back in 1987, under a revenue procedure that we still use today, that anything that is not defined in their literature that they give us, or that where Congress has told us to place assets, there's a default that says it's 7-year property. So the exotic game animals aren't defined anywhere, and so they would default to 7-year property for depreciation purposes.
Roger, overall, what would you say is the big takeaway we need to keep in mind?
Well, I think the big takeaway from a tax standpoint is that you're probably going to be treated as a farmer, and that can also have an impact at the state level, too, for zoning purposes, because a lot of counties in the states do not zone agriculture, and in fact, the state law may prevent them from zoning agriculture, and so you may get an extra benefit there. These are ag operations that perhaps are not subject to county zoning, so I think there's a double benefit, tax and then perhaps at the state level.
All right. Well, Roger, as always, thanks for your insight today. Roger McEowen, he's with the Washburn University School of Law, on the phone with us today from Topeka, Kansas. You can go online to washburnlaw.edu for additional information.